The other TV on. Back. Driver, get out of the car! Driver, get out of the car! Morton, get out of the car!
There's two.
Okay, I didn't see her at all. Passenger, stay in the car! Driver, out of the car!
Two.
Out of the car, hands up! Walk backwards towards that side of my car, now! Turn around and walk backwards! Walk backwards! Walk backwards! Quit tensing up. Go through.
On summer nights in Detroit, sound travels. Laughter floats over fences, music pulses through thin walls, and secrets, if you listen closely, begin to hum under everything. That night, the city sounded ordinary. Cicadas, car doors, a neighbor hosing down the driveway. Nothing in the air warned anyone about the violence that would soon stain a backyard and ripple across the internet. And yet, if you knew where to look, if you knew which eyes to watch, which words to replay, you might have sensed a crack widening, the kind that starts in silence and ends in blood. This story begins long before the pool, long before the tripod, and the red live icon. It begins with three young men who believed their history made them unbreakable. Marcus Reed, 27, lived with his mother in a modest two-story on the west side, a house whose paint had faded in the sun, whose porch light always worked, whose kitchen smelled of coffee and laundry soap. To neighbors, Marcus was polite, the kind who carried groceries, who kept his head down. To his friends he was loyal, someone you could call at 2 a.m., someone who'd show up and say very little but do exactly what you needed. Eric Miller, 28, was the spark. He liked the camera, liked the crowd, liked the way a small moment could be turned into a story if you framed it right. He worked hard at the auto shop, but his real talent was people, making them laugh, making them watch, making them feel like they were part of something fun. When Eric pulled out his phone, the world became a stage. He wasn't cruel. He just understood attention, and sometimes attention demanded a punchline. David Johnson, 26, was the balanced, steady, generous, the friend who could diffuse a tense room with a shrug and a grin. He hung between Marcus's quiet intensity and Eric's showman energy, the way a bridge hangs between two shores. If there was ever a referee among them, it was David. He loved them both, and that love had held for years. But even the strongest bridge can creak when the river swells. For Marcus, the river had a name: Linda. His mother had raised him alone after his father left no child support, no Sunday visits. Just a boy and a woman who refused to let him drown. She worked long shifts at the grocery store, came home with sore feet and soft eyes, and never once let the light in that house flicker. To Marcus, she wasn't simply a parent. She was proof that love could be steel, proof that sacrifice could be holy. And in a group where jokes flew like bottle rockets, Linda was the one subject that was sacred. If you've ever sat with a man like Marcus, you've seen it the way teasing about rent or jobs lands, how it sits in the jaw and tightens the shoulders. For years he learned to laugh along. Yeah, man, still at the house. Yup, my mom can cook better than yours. Little deflections that kept peace without admitting pain. The jokes weren't constant, and they weren't always mean, but repetition carves grooves. And in quiet rooms, shame echoes. In the spring of 2022, money got tighter. Marcus picked up temp shifts and lost them just as quickly. He dated a little. Nothing stuck. Every time something slipped through his fingers, he told himself to hold tighter to what he still had. His mother, his friends, the rituals, Friday beers, pickup games, birthdays that ended with takeout cartons and tired laughter. The kind of life you can carry without thinking until the carrying wears you out. Eric had started streaming more short lives, 20 minutes here and there, just enough to keep people watching. He didn't mean harm. He meant momentum. The internet was a current, and he was learning how to ride it. A joke that landed in the yard landed bigger online. A face that blushed in front of 10 friends became content for hundreds. The world had become a room with too many doors. And when you laughed in that room, you never knew who was listening. The first time Eric dropped a line about Marcus still living at home on a stream, the comments lit like fireworks. Not hateful, just quick. Bro's a mama's boy for... Ain't no shame in saving $. Emojis that laughed and cried at the same time. Marcus forced a smile and raised his beer toward the camera. That half-second gesture men learn when feeling small. If you toast the joke, maybe it won't cut you. Later that night, alone, he scrolled through those comments in the dark and told himself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. There are only so many places a man can put his pride. By July, the plan for a pool party felt simple, necessary, like a pressure valve. The invitation was casual. Someone had a backyard big enough. Someone else had speakers. Everyone could bring a little something. David sent a message that read like a guarantee. We need this. In summer, Detroit can feel like it's forgiving you. Heat that slows the blood. Sunsets that make everything look softer. You forget, for a few hours, the things you're tired of remembering. But a party doesn't erase a pattern, and a camera doesn't know when to look away. True crime stories often hinge on a moment, the sound of a door, the flash of metal, the way someone says a name. But they rarely begin there. They begin with the smaller moments we're tempted to ignore. A face that goes still during a laugh. A hand that tightens around a bottle. A comment that lands heavier than it should. The signs were there. A careful viewer can rewind and point to them, frame by frame. At the time, everyone keeps dancing. The night before the party, Marcus sat at the kitchen table while Linda folded laundry. The television murmured low. The house smelled like detergent and rain. You going out tomorrow? She asked without looking up. He said yes. She smiled. Take some pictures, she said, that little motherly wish to be included without intruding. Marcus nodded and said he would. He didn't mention the streams. He didn't mention the comments. He didn't mention the feeling that the ground under him had begun to move. If you're listening now, if you've made it this far, you already know where this is going. You know the pool, the tripod, the red dot blinking in the corner of the screen. You know the laugh that goes too far, and the man whose face hardens when his mother's name becomes a punchline. You know the knife. You know the sirens. But before all of that, there were boys who became men together. Men who believed loyalty could carry them over any break, and a son who had built his whole identity on protecting the one person who had always protected him. Sometimes a story doesn't warn you. Sometimes it does, and you're too close to hear it. When Eric pressed go live the next evening, he didn't think he was opening a door he couldn't close. He thought he was inviting people in, the way he always did, into a circle of music and water and jokes that have traveled the same path so many times they feel harmless. David tossed a ball, someone cracked a beer, someone jumped in the pool. The camera watched from its cheap tripod, silent, patient, honest, in a way human beings rarely are. And Marcus? He sat at the edge with that practiced half-smile, watching the surface of the water tremble. In it, a reflection broke and mended. Broke and mended. As if the face looking back at him didn't quite belong to the man everyone thought they knew. If this were a different kind of story, we'd end the night with fireworks and tired hugs. But this is not that story. This is the one where a line gets crossed in front of an audience, where pride hardens into fury, and fury looks for a tool, where friendship can't hold against the weight of a single sacred name said wrong, at the wrong time, in the wrong light. After tonight, people will replay the video and ask the same questions that haunt every crime like this. Was there a second when it could have stopped? A word someone could have swallowed? A joke someone could have left unsaid? They'll pause frames and circle faces and count the beats between laughter and violence. They'll try to locate the hinge as if understanding it could undo what happened next. But in real time, no one paused. The music kept playing, the comments kept coming, and the red light on the phone kept telling the truth. The whole world was watching, even if no one yet understood what they were about to see. Tell me when a man has built his life on defending the only person who never left him, what happens when he feels he's failed her in public? What does loyalty become when it's humiliated under a spotlight? And what do we owe each other, in rooms both real and digital, when laughter turns into a blade? The answers are coming. You might not like them. For years, Marcus Reed had lived in the shadows of his louder, more charismatic friends. Eric Johnson and David Carter were the life of every party, quick with jokes, charming in conversation, and magnetic to those around them. Marcus, by contrast, was quieter, reserved, always on the edges of the group. He was the kind of man who spoke little but observed much, who carried a loyalty that seemed unshakable, even when it cost him his dignity. The three had grown up in the same Detroit neighborhood. Their bond was forged in adolescence, backyard basketball games, nights spent playing video games until dawn, and weekends roaming the city streets. To outsiders, they seemed inseparable, brothers by choice rather than by blood. Yet beneath the surface, fractures had long been forming. Eric and David, with their bold personalities, often turned Marcus into the punchline of their jokes. Sometimes it was playful, the kind of ribbing that friends endure. But other times, it cut deeper. They mocked his clothes, his silence, his lack of ambition. The cruelest jabs were always about his mother, a woman Marcus revered. To him, she was everything, his rock, his reason to keep going. When the others disrespected her, it wasn't just teasing. It was a blade twisting in his chest. Still, Marcus stayed. Loyalty, or perhaps dependency, kept him tethered to the friendship. He told himself that deep down, they cared for him, that the mockery was just a mask for affection. But the truth was more complicated. Marcus was the quiet one, the dependable one, the man who would never push back no matter how far the jokes went. And in that imbalance, resentment grew like a shadow. By the time the summer of 2023 arrived, their friendship had become strained. Eric and David's popularity only magnified the distance. They were throwing parties, streaming live on social media, gaining attention and followers, while Marcus watched from the sidelines. He joined the gatherings, yes, but more and more, he felt like an outsider at his own table. And then came the pool party. It was supposed to be a night of laughter, music, and summer fun. A backyard filled with drinks, splashing water, and the warm glow of string lights. Guests gathered around the pool, phones in hand, recording snippets of the night for Instagram and TikTok. The air smelled of barbecue and chlorine, of beer and sweat. Music thumped from speakers. Laughter echoed off the fence. And for a brief moment, it seemed like nothing could disturb the joy. But even in that celebration, the cracks in the friendship showed. Eric, his phone streaming live to hundreds of viewers, couldn't resist poking fun at Marcus once again. The comments rolled in from strangers watching, laughing, encouraging the humiliation. David joined in, his words sharp, his laughter louder than the music. And then, the insult Marcus could not bear, the one about his mother, was thrown like a grenade into the night. At first, Marcus tried to swallow it, as he always had. He forced a tight smile, turned his gaze away, let the laughter of others drown his anger. But inside, something snapped. The years of mockery, the feeling of being small, the loyalty that had never been returned. All of it collided. In that instant, the betrayal was complete. He looked at his friends and no longer saw brothers. He saw enemies. He saw the embodiment of every wound they had inflicted, every cut disguised as a joke. And while the others laughed, unaware of the storm building inside him, Marcus felt something darker take root. A silence, a focus, a rage. From the outside, no one noticed. The party went on, drinks poured, music blared. But within Marcus, the decision had already been made. What began as a friendship, what had once been the closest bond of his life, was about to turn into something else entirely. Something deadly. The pool water rippled under the soft glow of string lights, their reflections dancing in the chlorinated blue. The night was heavy with humidity, thick with the smell of grilled meat, cigarette smoke, and spilled beer. From the outside, it looked like any summer gathering in Detroit, a mix of laughter, shouts, and music pounding against the neighborhood's quiet. Phones were everywhere, their cameras capturing every splash, every toast, every joke that flew across the air like darts. Marcus sat at the edge of it all, silent, nursing a drink that had long since lost its fizz. His eyes scanned the crowd not with joy, not with camaraderie, but with a cold detachment. The voices of Eric and David rose above the others, amplified not just by alcohol but by the confidence of being the center of attention. They were streaming live, as always, their faces glowing in the light of a phone screen, their comments filling with laughing emojis and taunts from strangers who had no idea the knife they were twisting. To Marcus, the moment played like a slow burn. Every laugh directed at him, every smirk from his so-called friends, piled on top of years of humiliation. The music couldn't drown it out, the chatter around him couldn't distract him. He heard only one thing, the way they spoke about his mother, reducing the woman he cherished into a punchline for their entertainment. His breathing changed, slow and measured. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with something colder, more focused. He rose from his seat, unnoticed at first, blending into the chaos of the party. He slipped into the house, the noise fading behind him, swallowed by the dimly lit interior. Inside, it was quieter. The thump of the bass was muffled by walls, replaced by the distant echo of laughter spilling in through open windows. The air smelled faintly of bleach and old wood, a stark contrast to the party outside. Marcus moved with purpose, his mind no longer debating, no longer questioning. Every step was heavy, deliberate. In the kitchen drawer, his hand found what he was looking for. Cold steel. A knife. Sharp enough to cut through meat and bone, gleaming faintly in the half-light. He held it, and felt a grim resolve wash over him. He wasn't thinking of escape. He wasn't thinking of consequences. He was thinking only of the betrayal, of the years of silence he had endured, of the moment his mother's name became fodder for strangers watching through a phone screen. When Marcus stepped back outside, the night seemed louder, brighter, almost mocking. Eric and David were still performing for their invisible audience, their laughter high-pitched, their drinks sloshing. They didn't see the storm in his eyes. They didn't notice the blade glinting at his side. The first strike came fast, too fast for Eric to react. The livestream caught the shift, the blur of movement, the sudden gasp, the camera shaking as someone dropped their phone. Viewers thought it was a prank at first, another wild stunt for entertainment. But then came the scream, raw and unfiltered, slicing through the music. David stumbled backward, his laughter gone, his face twisting in horror. Marcus turned on him next, the knife rising and falling in a frenzy that had been years in the making. The crowd erupted in panic shouts, crashes, bodies scrambling for safety. Someone yelled to cut the stream. Someone else dialed 911, but the chaos was too thick, too immediate. Blood spilled onto the deck, dark and glistening under the lights. The once playful party became a nightmare, a stage for violence that no one could comprehend. Guests screamed, some froze, others fled into the night. And all the while, Marcus kept moving, his face expressionless, his body carrying out what his mind had already decided long before. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. The music cut off. The laughter vanished. Only the sound of ragged breathing and sobs remained. Eric lay still, David groaned, and Marcus stood over them, chest heaving, knife dripping. He looked around at the faces of the crowd, their phones still clutched in trembling hands, their eyes wide with shock and terror. He wasn't afraid of them. He wasn't ashamed. He was calm, almost too calm. And then, without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a scene that would haunt every witness for the rest of their lives. The pool water still rippled, but now it reflected more than lights. It reflected the blood that stained the night forever. The backyard was a battlefield of chaos. Screams echoed into the night as bodies pushed and stumbled over one another, a desperate attempt to escape what they had just witnessed. The music had stopped, but the sound of panic was louder than any song. Some people dropped their phones, others clung to them, streaming and recording in disbelief. What had begun as a summer pool party was now being broadcast to hundreds, soon thousands of horrified strangers across the internet. Eric lay motionless near the deck, his chest slick with blood, his eyes glassy. David writhed on the ground, clutching his side, his breaths sharp and shallow. The once rowdy crowd stood frozen for a beat, then scattered like a flock of startled birds. The smell of chlorine, mixed with the metallic tang of blood, saturating the humid Detroit air. Marcus walked with eerie calm, the knife still in his hand. He didn't run. He didn't panic. His face was unreadable, his steps slow and deliberate, as if the chaos unfolding around him belonged to someone else entirely. One witness later told investigators, "It was like he wasn't even in the same world as us. Everyone else was screaming, crying, running. But him? He was calm. Too calm." Calls to 911 poured in. Dispatchers struggled to make sense of overlapping voices, The hysteria of partygoers shouting about stabbings, live streams, and blood everywhere. Sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the night like a warning. David's screams weakened, replaced by faint groans, and then silence. Guests who had once laughed at his jokes were now pressing towels and shirts against his wounds, their hands slick with blood, their own bodies shaking with adrenaline. Some prayed under their breath, others cursed Marcus's name. Inside the house, someone finally managed to shut off the live stream. But by then, it was too late. The footage had already been captured, screenshotted, shared, and saved by strangers across social media. What was meant to humiliate Marcus had transformed into evidence of a brutal double homicide. Police cars skidded to a stop out front, red and blue lights flashing against the neighborhood's quiet houses. Officers rushed in, guns drawn, shouting commands over the din of screams. They found Eric already gone, David unresponsive, and Marcus walking calmly down the street, his clothes stained, his knife loosely dangling in his hand. When ordered to drop the weapon, Marcus didn't resist. He set the knife on the ground, raised his hands, and looked directly at the officers. Witnesses later recalled his expression. It wasn't fear, it wasn't regret. It was emptiness. Neighbors peered through blinds and doorways, drawn out by the flashing lights and shouting. Some filmed from a distance, others whispered prayers. Children were pulled inside by frantic parents, shielded from the sight of blood pooling near the backyard deck. By the time the paramedics arrived, the yard was silent except for the occasional sob and the crackle of police radios. The bodies were covered. The laughter that had once filled the space was gone forever. News traveled fast. Within hours, local outlets picked up the story of a Detroit man stabbing two friends during a live stream. By morning, it had spread across the country. Headlines filled with words like shocking, gruesome, and unthinkable. Clips of the video circulated despite desperate attempts to remove them. The internet, once a stage for Eric and David's jokes, had now become the courtroom of public opinion. For Marcus's mother, the news was unbearable. Her name, the one mocked in that live stream, was now tangled in the tragedy. Reporters camped outside her home, cameras flashing, neighbors whispering. Some pitied her, others blamed her, cruelly suggesting that her son's act of violence was a reflection of her. Detectives worked through the night, interviewing witnesses whose stories overlapped in fragments of fear and shock. Some admitted they thought Marcus was joking until they saw the blood. Others confessed they had seen the tension building for years, how Marcus always sat in silence while Eric and David ridiculed him. One friend whispered, "We should have seen it coming." Friend. At the precinct, Marcus sat in a cold interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table. He didn't demand a lawyer right away. He didn't shout, didn't cry. He spoke only when spoken to, his answers short, almost detached. When asked why, his reply was chilling in its simplicity. "They disrespected my mother." The detectives pressed for more, but Marcus said little else. It wasn't rage that fueled him anymore, it was resolve. Outside, the community tried to make sense of the horror. Vigils were held for Eric and David, candles flickering in the Detroit night, posters covered with photos of the two young men smiling, their lives frozen in snapshots of happier days. But even in grief, the controversy simmered. Some people condemned Marcus outright, calling him a monster. Others whispered about years of bullying, humiliation, and betrayal. The line between victim and aggressor blurred in conversations, though the law was clear. Marcus had taken 2 lives. The pool deck, once a symbol of summer joy, was now stained with memory. Neighbors avoided walking past the house, as if the shadows of that night still lingered. And for those who had been there, the screams replayed every time they closed their eyes. Marcus's arrest didn't end the story. It only began the next chapter, a trial that would force the world to look closely at what happens when humiliation, rage, and betrayal collide in the most public of ways. The courthouse in downtown Detroit became the stage for a drama that drew in not only the local community, but also the nation. By the time Marcus's case reached trial, months had passed since that summer night. Yet the shockwaves had not settled. The video footage had already made its rounds across the internet, dissected frame by strangers who turned themselves into armchair detectives, commentators, and critics. On the first day of trial, the courtroom was packed. Journalists filled every seat, their pens poised, cameras waiting outside. Family members of Eric and David wore black, clutching tissues, some with framed photos of the young men whose lives had ended so abruptly. Across the aisle sat Marcus, dressed in a plain suit provided by his defense attorney, his hands folded neatly on the table. He looked thinner, quieter, his eyes fixed forward, never once scanning the crowd. The prosecution painted a picture of cold-blooded murder. They replayed the video for the jury, though heavily edited, showing the moments leading up to the stabbing. The sound of laughter, the insults directed at Marcus's mother, and then the sudden shift. Screams, blood, and chaos. Jurors turned away, some covering their mouths, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The prosecutor's voice rang with conviction. Ladies and gentlemen, this was not an accident. This was not self-defense. This was a deliberate act. 2 young men are dead because Marcus Johnson decided his pride outweighed their lives. The defense took a different approach. They did not deny Marcus's actions. Instead, they argued the years of ridicule, bullying, and humiliation had driven him to a breaking point. Witnesses testified about the constant teasing, the cruel jokes, the live streams that mocked him. They described Marcus as a man who rarely fought back, who swallowed his anger until it boiled over on that fateful night. One friend, voice trembling, admitted on the stand, "We all laughed. We thought it was harmless. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe we pushed him too far." The courtroom shifted with every word. Some jurors leaned forward, their brows furrowed in sympathy. Others sat rigid, unmoved, their gazes fixed on the grieving families of Eric and David. Marcus's mother was called to testify. Her voice cracked as she spoke of her son, a quiet boy who grew up carrying burdens silently. She described how the insults about her had cut deeper than anyone realized. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "He wasn't protecting me. He was carrying my shame. And it destroyed him." But the prosecution was relentless. They reminded the jury of the knife Marcus brought to the party, the calculated nature of his actions. This was not the heat of the moment. This was a choice, a deadly choice. The trial stretched on for weeks, the tension never easing. Every day, the families of Eric and David sat in the front row, their grief raw and visible. Every day Marcus sat expressionless, his hands folded, his voice quiet. He never testified, leaving his attorney to speak for him. Outside the courthouse, the public was divided. Some demanded the maximum penalty, calling Marcus a murderer with no excuse. Others whispered about the darker side of humiliation and bullying, asking if society itself had played a role in pushing him to violence. Talk shows debated it. Social media ignited with arguments. Hashtags carried the names of the dead, while others carried Marcus's. When the time for closing arguments arrived, the courtroom was silent. The prosecution stood firm. You cannot excuse murder. Whatever words were said, whatever jokes were made, nothing justifies stabbing two unarmed men to death. Justice for Eric and David demands a verdict of guilty. The defense countered with a plea for understanding, if not forgiveness. This is not a monster. This is a man who broke under years of ridicule. He should be held accountable, yes, but not condemned without context. He deserves mercy. The jury deliberated for hours that stretched into a full day. The city held its breath. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, broadcasting live updates every half hour. Families wept in the hallways, clutching each other's hands. Finally, the jury returned. The foreperson stood, holding the slip of paper that would decide Marcus's fate. The courtroom went silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner. We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Johnson. The pause was excruciating. Guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. Gasps filled the room. Some cried out in relief, others in despair. Eric and David's families clung to one another, tears streaming down their faces. Marcus's mother collapsed into her chair, her sobs muffled against her hands. Marcus himself did not flinch. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, staring straight ahead. For him, the verdict was not unexpected. Perhaps it was even a kind of release. The judge later sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms in prison, with the possibility of parole after 40 years. The gavel struck, and with it, Marcus's life outside those walls was over. Reporters rushed to capture reactions. Some headlines praised the verdict as justice served. Others questioned whether justice had truly been achieved, or whether the tragedy was simply compounded by another life destroyed. But for the families of Eric and David, nothing could bring their sons back. The candles, the vigils, the framed photos, they were all reminders of futures cut short. For Marcus's mother, the sentence meant visiting her son behind glass for the rest of her life. The trial ended, but the questions lingered. What if someone had intervened sooner? What if the laughter had stopped before it became cruelty? What if Marcus had asked for help instead of reaching for a knife? In the end, the courtroom provided a verdict, but not closure. When the trial ended and the courtroom lights dimmed, the story of Marcus Johnson, Eric, and David did not fade away. Instead, it echoed through Detroit and beyond, weaving its way into conversations about violence, pride, and the invisible wounds left by humiliation. The city was left not only with the memories of 2 young men gone too soon, but also with the haunting image of another man who had thrown his future away in a moment of rage. For the families of Eric and David, grief became a daily companion. Their homes, once filled with laughter and noise, now felt hollow. Eric's mother kept his bedroom exactly as he had left it. The basketball trophies still lined up neatly on the dresser. David's father replayed old voicemails just to hear his son's voice again. They both spoke at community events, their words trembling with pain, pleading with others to remember their sons, not as victims in a headline, but as real, vibrant young men whose dreams had been stolen. Meanwhile, Marcus began serving his sentence in a state prison far from Detroit. Behind the steel doors and concrete walls, he became just another inmate, stripped of his identity beyond a number. To fellow prisoners, he was not Marcus, the man who had once been mocked at parties. He was not Marcus, the son who carried his mother's shame. He was simply a man serving life. Yet within those walls, the weight of what he had done clung to him. Letters from his mother arrived often, her handwriting shaky, her words filled with a mixture of sorrow and love. She never stopped calling him my boy, even though the world now saw him as a murderer. Outside prison walls, the case continued to stir debate. Talk shows dissected the events over and over. Was Marcus a cold-blooded killer, or was he a broken man pushed past his limits? Schools held assemblies about bullying, using his story as a cautionary tale. Some teachers read aloud from news reports, warning students about the ripple effects of humiliation. Parents whispered to each other at basketball games, wondering how far their own children might go if pushed too far. Social media, relentless as ever, refused to let the story die. Hashtags carried the names of Eric and David, reminding the world of the lives that had been lost. Others circulated Marcus's name, some condemning him, others calling for compassion. Videos resurfaced clips of the fateful live stream, grainy but unforgettable. Each time the footage appeared, it reopened old wounds for the families, forcing them to relive their darkest night. But amid the anger and the mourning, some sought meaning. Community leaders organized forums, inviting psychologists, teachers, and youth mentors to discuss the dangers of unchecked humiliation and toxic masculinity. They spoke of how young men were often taught to hide their pain, to bury their shame, until it erupted in violence. Marcus's case became a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of warning. Yet for all the conversations, the streets of Detroit still felt the same. Parties continued. Live streams carried on. Jokes at someone else's expense echoed in basements and backyards. The lesson was there, but whether it was heard that remained uncertain. Years later, the case still haunted those who had been there. Friends who once laughed at Marcus's expense admitted privately that the guilt never left them. They replayed the moment in their minds, wishing they had stopped, wishing they had stepped in before the knife was drawn. Their laughter, once careless, had become a curse they could not escape. Marcus, now older and grayer, marked time in prison. Every birthday was a reminder of the life he had lost. Every parole hearing a reminder of the lives he had taken. He was haunted, too, not by the verdict, but by the faces of Eric and David, boys he once called friends. In the end, the story of Marcus Johnson was not just about murder. It was about pride, shame, and the silent wars people fight within themselves. It was about the dangerous intersection of humiliation and masculinity, where words cut as deep as knives, and laughter can be more deadly than silence. True crime stories often search for lessons, neat endings, or justice neatly tied with a bow. But this story resisted that. Justice had been served in a legal sense. Two families received a verdict. The killer was sentenced, the law carried out its duty. Yet no one walked away whole. No sentence could erase the pain of parents who buried their sons. No courtroom decision could restore Marcus's life outside prison walls. And so, the case lived on not in law books, but in whispers, in warnings, in the uneasy silence that follows cruel laughter. For those who remembered that summer night, the pool party would never be just another gathering. It would forever be the place where laughter turned to screams, where pride turned to blood, and where 3 lives, 2 lost, 1 destroyed, were bound together in tragedy. In the end, Detroit carried the story like a scar, visible, permanent. A reminder that sometimes the deadliest weapons are not knives or guns, but words.